Hey everybody, my name is Mark Peralta. I am the Senior Director of National Mission Advancement for Best Friends Animal Society. I just want to thank everyone for joining us today. We do these town halls almost every Thursday at this same time. Today's town hall is called Leveling the Playing Field, and we're really excited to talk about a really important topic with some really great panelists. Again, I am the moderator tonight. And we are going to go ahead and start the broadcast while I'm sure other people are logging in. And I want to just start with a few housekeeping items, if that's all right with everybody. First and foremost, I just want to let everybody know that you're going to automatically be muted. That's everybody who is in attendance for the presentation portion of the webinar. But you don't have to worry about accidentally unmuting yourself, anything like that. That way there's no interruptions. If you have any questions at any point, please do type those into the chat box. Those questions are submitted through a Q&A box and they're only visible to us on the back end. So we will get those as you continue to ask your questions throughout the town hall. We may pause a few times throughout the presentation to answer questions from the Q&A. If they're relevant to the topic at hand. But we have scheduled time for additional questions and for me to be able to field your questions to the panelists. So don't worry, we'll have plenty of time for that as well. So keep an eye on the chat box also for links and resources, especially in items that we're going to be bringing up through the town hall. These plus more will also be posted to the resource section on the town hall webpage. So that will be probably sometime tomorrow. Also, please note that the webinar is being recorded and it will be available after the session via our website. And we'll make sure that you have the link to that as well. And I just want to let everybody know that there's a couple of podcasts, Best Friends podcasts to be aware of. First and foremost, episode 19, which is The New Data is Here. The New Data is Here. So check that out. We'll link that for you as well. And we have a new podcast, 21, Treating Animals and People as Individuals, which is a really good secondary podcast and talk that has a lot to do with today's topic here on this town hall. So definitely check all of that stuff out. And I want to go ahead and introduce you to our amazing panelists. First and foremost, Akeisha Townsend-Eaton. She is a legislative attorney for us here at Best Friends. Scott Giacopo. He is the Director of National Shelter Outreach for Best Friends. We are lucky enough to have Larry Gross. Larry Gross is the Executive Director of the Coalition for Economic Survival, and he's also the President of the LA Board of Animal Services Commissioners. And lastly but not least, Lydia LaSalle. She is the Executive Director for Best Friends Salt Lake City. So why don't we go ahead and get started with these great panelists. Thank you guys for joining us. Keisha, is it okay if I go ahead and start with you? And I want to get into some of the stuff that's in your purview. So obviously as an attorney for Best Friends, I would love for us to talk about some of the specific laws that disproportionately affect low income and BIPOC communities. And for those of you that are on the chat that don't know what BIPOC stands for, it's Black, Indigenous, People of Color, just to make sure that that's clear. First, I would love for you, Akeisha, to talk to us about how cities and counties and or communities definition of ownership for animals does this.
Absolutely, Mark. So at Best Friends, we work to advance life-saving at all levels of government with a significant focus on local law and policy. So generally, local codes pertaining to animals consist of certain requirements and responsibilities that a person must follow in order to be able to keep an animal, and they also complement state law. So typically, as you said, that person who has that responsibility is defined as an owner. And the most common reason for a definition of owner being created in the first place is really to establish a duty of care for that animal, such as providing food, water, and shelter. Now, of course, these are certainly good things for dogs and cats who share a home with a person and are actually owned by someone. When I was working on the animal cruelty side at another organization, I used to draft these requirements. But where it gets tricky and even perverse, I would say, is when the definition is used not to incentivize but instead penalize someone trying to take care of an animal who doesn't live with him, say, for instance, a free roaming community cat. So here's an example. So some jurisdictions will define owner as anyone who provides any level of care to an animal, including putting food out for a stray cat. Some go even further to limit the number of pets a person can be the owner of. So for instance, imagine trying to care for a colony of 10 cats if your city has a 2-pet limit and defines owner in this restrictive way. In this instance, it could be that just feeding a neighborhood cat could make you the owner. And because you are an owner, that means you're also subject to all of the requirements of ownership, including any licensing, registration, or vaccination requirements just for feeding that cat. And it doesn't stop there. Failure to abide by these requirements might result in hefty fees, a mandatory court appearance, or in the worst case, jail time. And outcomes like these are one of the many reasons why we advocate exempting cat caretakers from the traditional definition of owner. So we're talking about communities of color and other vulnerable communities. Laws like this that attach penalties to ownership are definitely an issue in communities of color for a couple of reasons. The first reason is that communities of color are more likely to have a higher number of free roaming cats and dogs in the neighborhood because they are also in resource deserts, for one. Another reason is they're also less likely, to complain to local authorities about stray animals being a nuisance. Second, though not all people of color are in the low income bracket, those of us who do fit in that bracket are often unable to pay an initial fine or a fee in a timely manner. So what that does is it leads to a snowball effect of even more fees for delinquency, interactions with the court system, and other ramifications. We talk about vulnerable groups, including the elderly, who are also subject to these penalties, just for taking care of cats. So we're in result criminalizing kindness. And the end result for the animals is that they often wind up being killed in shelters because we're trying to penalize their owners. So that's really a lose-lose situation. Instead of making owner so restrictive and penalizing people for caring for animals, we need sensible policies that protect animals and the people trying to do the right thing by them.
Thank you, Akeisha. And I'm glad you brought up licensing. And I want to kind of follow up a little bit more specifically on licensing, because for many of us in animal welfare, and especially animal companion welfare, licensing is very prominent and widespread as a way to show responsible pet ownership. But there are negative effects to licensing to BIPOC and low-income communities. And I know you touched on it a little bit here, but can you explain a little bit further why that is?
Yeah, absolutely. So first, I think right off the bat, every community, regardless of demographics, should be asking itself, are cat and dog licenses even necessary? And a growing number of communities are answering this question with no. For instance, just recently, Cary, North Carolina, which had been requiring licensing since 1982, discontinued this requirement for dogs and cats. And the reason why this is because there was the large purpose of having licensing in the first place was to be able to reunite lost pets with owners. But what they were finding in their encounters with pet owners was that only about 5% of people even had licenses, compared to 75% of people who had gotten microchips for their pets. What's more, they found that the administrative cost of implementing the licensing program to be far more than the revenue it generated. And there were also very few avenues for residents to actually learn about those licensing programs. So when we're talking about communities in the COVID era, especially those that have lower income populations, higher minority populations, I think that you know, in these cash-strapped days, it's really important to avoid the lure of supplementing budgets with fines and fees, because ultimately they're more costly to have than not to have them. They penalize the most vulnerable among us, and they lead to poor outcomes for dogs and cats in the end. Now, Carrie, which I just mentioned, is an example of a win-win scenario for community and pets. In that instance, there was an unnecessary barrier to ownership that was removed, and they saw an alternative that worked. But in far too many communities, we still have a system set up to penalize people for having pets. You know, I mentioned ownership just a minute ago, but this isn't the only area. We're talking about licensing now. So for instance, think about situations where the failure to obtain a pet license ends up with a person in jail and the pet being killed because the person isn't either aware of the significance of not getting a license, or can't afford the license, or the impound fee if the animal happened to be at large, or both. And again, that's really a perverse use of a law that was originally intended to help people and pets. It's an injustice. And some people might be asking, really? Do people go to jail for not having a dog or cat license? And that was a surprise to me as well, but the answer is yes. And the answer is disproportionately yes for communities of color. So there's a story that I was recently reading about an African-American mother and teacher in a southern state who was arrested and jailed for failure to have a dog license. In this case, her son, a Black male, was cited for not having a license, but going back to the conversation on owner, because she was the owner of the dog, she was the one who was responsible for this violation. Now, I'll note that the dog, to my knowledge, was not dangerous. She wasn't being cruel to the animal or neglectful. She just failed to pay a fee. And if you remember in the Carrie example, only a very small percentage of people in any communities tend to have all of the appropriate licenses and registrations for their pet, but most of these people don't go to jail. However, in this particular community that this woman was cited in, a media investigation uncovered nearly 200 arrests for failure to get a pet license. And not surprisingly, a disproportionate number of those arrested were Black residents. The investigation also found that for some of these residents, the failure to get a pet license was their introduction into the city's court system and their only initial crime. So this could actually point to a pattern of selective enforcement when it comes to enforcing punitive animal laws. Just like someone who looks like me is more likely to encounter an officer in a traffic stop, it seems that animal control violations in some cases may penalize some more than others. So, and then, you know, recounting her situation in this incident, the woman in the story said she was petrified in jail, and also said that she regretted having something on her record that's going to be there until the day she died. She works in education, so imagine what impact this would have. You know, a criminal record for not having a license is going to have on her being able to get another teaching job or be able to provide for her family. Now, interestingly, the same animal services office who issued the citation is the same office doing local adoptions. But if you were this woman or one of her family members or one of her neighbors and heard that people who look like you with pets seem to be more of a target for arrest, would you adopt from this place, or would you even have a pet? So I think that we should be really taking a hard look at all of the violations that we have that aren't cruelty related, including but not limited to licensing, and asking ourselves if we are disproportionately citing certain groups and not others, why that is, and what the outcomes are for animals and the people caring for them. And, you know, in this current day and age, these issues are getting more attention, and we really shouldn't have to wait for the press to do this for us. That kind of coverage, of course, is not great for us, but it also discourages communities from ever interfacing with the shelters and animal services to begin with.
Thank you, Akeisha. And on the same realm as licensing, you know, mandatory spay neuter is something that's often very popular amongst groups and organizations in animal welfare. But Best Friends and many other groups actually don't support mandatory spay neuter, and I think that's surprising for some. Can you explain why that is and how this actually also is a policy that disproportionately affects low-income and BIPOC communities as well?
Sure. So, yeah, I think it's a surprise to many and myself as well. But I think one of the reasons why we as an organization don't support mandatory spay neuter is because we've been able to see how it is not effective as it is intended to be. So, in Los Angeles, for example, there was a mandatory spay neuter law passed in 2008. In fact, it was one of the nation's toughest laws on pet sterilization, requiring most dogs and cats to be neutered by 4 months. The ordinance penalized violators with up to $500 in fines or 40 hours of community service. Yet, in only a few years after the mandatory spay neuter ordinance was put into effect, 38% more dogs were impounded and 50% more dogs were euthanized than the year prior to the ordinance taking effect. So in the wake of the mandatory spay neuter laws, what we did was we launched a program called No Kill LA, which works to bring together passionate individuals, city shelters, and an entire coalition of animal welfare organizations to end the killing of dogs and cats in shelters. And as a result, the save rate for dogs increased by 71% in 2011 to 79% in 2017. And for cats, this is amazing, 36% for cats in 2011 compared to 79% saved in 2017. And recently we've seen in the Journal of American Veterinary Medical Association, it stated that the most beneficiaries of these clinics fall between the national, or excuse me, fall below the national median income levels. And a lot of people within that bracket are people of color. What's also interesting to note is that out of the people who went to these programs and took advantages of these services, the largest numbers of clients stated that the population control incentive was really the reason for them seeking these services. And the least number of clients stated that spay or neuter was being sought because of a law or regulation requiring them to do so. So it does show that most people do desire to do the right thing for the right reasons, and that very few people are highly motivated by a city requirement mandating this to happen. And of course, we talked about the barriers that exist for even accessing these services, number one, and being in a position where you're facing a penalty because you weren't able to do something earlier, but you want to, you're just afraid to be, zinged with that and possibly have your animal taken away as a result. So that's one of the many reasons I think, why we look for alternatives to mandatory spay neuter.
And before we conclude with Akeisha, I just want to remind everybody who is attending to please, as questions come up, do not hesitate to put those questions in the chat, as we'll be able to field those questions when we're done with some initial talks through all of the panel. So please don't be shy. You don't need to hold on to them. Please continue to put those questions in the chat, and we will certainly get to many of them after we get through some preliminary talks with all of these great panelists. So Akeisha, lastly, be it shelter policy or an actual ordinance, can you also explain how pit bull and breed-specific policies also bring more hardships to low-income and BIPOC community members as well?
Sure. So in my experience, a lot of the restrictions and outright prohibitions we've seen for certain breeds are directly tied to a perception of what kinds of people own these dogs. I've heard them referred to sometimes, unfortunately, as thugs, drug dealers, and crackheads, which unfortunately are pejorative terms that are often code for Black men. So while we in animal welfare know that all kinds of people own all kinds of breeds, we're definitely not immune to the influence of these stereotypes. And sometimes we even perpetuate them. I've seen this implemented in shelter policies and local laws. For instance, you might see a reclaim fee on a pit bull type dog that's higher than if that dog were another breed. Um, you know, and part of the reason why that is that, you know, there is a presumption that, you know, maybe someone would not be able to pay to get that dog back. And if they really did care for this dog, they wouldn't have a problem doing that. But that's not necessarily the case. Another example might be an ordinance that does allow pit bulls and other types of breeds that are generally restricted in a community on the condition of having an expensive insurance policy or a fenced-in yard. When these types of things might not be available to, say, apartment dwellers or people with lower incomes. So I'll also note that these types of restrictions do nothing to promote safety. They do everything to punish dogs and their owners, including those who happen to be very responsible. I'll also note that while these are not only problematic for communities in terms of enforcement, they can also be costly to local governments. You know, for this reason, we have a breed discriminatory fiscal impact calculator to break down by zip code just how costly this policy can be for your community. And that includes litigation costs. For example, if someone decides to sue based on discrimination under constitutional grounds, which they do, the American Bar Association also passed a resolution which strongly opposes these bans and restrictions. So I think, you know, especially now when discrimination is under a magnifying glass, it now is a very good opportunity to really examine, reverse, and eliminate these discriminatory practices where they exist. And I am going to chat that calculator to you. Uh, Hopefully I can do that. So go ahead, Mark. I'll do that while you're talking. There you go.
All right, sounds good. And Keisha, thank you so much for all of that great information. And again, if you have any other questions for Keisha, we can definitely do that after we're done with the rest of the panelists. So obviously, Scott Giacopo. Scott, I get to work with every day. It's great to work and learn from somebody such as Scott. He is a national leader in field services. And Scott, thank you again for, it seems like you and I get to do these, and I'm lucky enough to get to talk to you anytime that I'm on these town halls. We're a team, man.
Yeah, these are great opportunities.
So obviously, if you don't know Scott, as an expert in animal services nationally, we're really eager in this town hall to hear some of the policies and laws that you specifically have encountered in your work. I think talking about, you know, impoundment ordinances maybe would be great as a start.
Yeah, and that it really is a great place to start, Mark, because impoundment is something that animal control deals with every day. And unfortunately, a lot of officers in a lot of locations are required by law that as soon as they put their hands on an animal, they have to impound that animal. And that's, you know, slight differences in laws where it says, you know, animal control shall impound. Changing it to may would prevent that. But a lot of agencies, a lot of ordinances don't. And I work with the officers all the time. And some of the things they try to do is they'll try to redefine in their policy what impoundment means, so that they're able to consider their legal obligation to impound complete as soon as they put their hands on an animal. And now they can do a return to owner. Because with the rise in microchips, and officers nowadays are carrying scanners in their trucks, and their goal is to get those animals back home. So like I said, in a lot of places, and I've been on ride-alongs with officers who, even though we scanned the animal or we knew where that animal was, the law strictly prohibited them from returning that animal, and they had to impound that animal. And it's sad when, especially if you're right in front of the owner's house. Now, granted, most of the officers that I've worked with will kind of like, okay, you know, tongue in cheek and kind of slip the animal off and what, you know, never happened. But they're breaking the law, and a lot of officers don't feel funny about that. I mean, as an officer, I didn't want to break the law at all. I'm in charge to enforce the law, so it puts them in an awkward position. it puts them in an awkward position where they have the opportunity to return the animal and they can't. Some laws even go as far, and I was just down in Texas where the law specifically said the animal shall be impounded to the local shelter. So they don't even have the option of saying, this is an impound now that I've put my hands on the animal, and they have to bring it in. And, you know, along those lines, Mark, if I may, you know, some of the other problems are the reclaim hours that some of these shelters have make it almost impossible to reclaim an animal. You know, I was working with an agency in California, and they were only open 10 to 4 Monday through Friday. So, and I said to the director, I said, so if my dog got impounded at 3:30 on a Friday afternoon, and I get home from work at 6, I can't pick him up until Monday morning, and I have to take the day off from work to do that. And he said, well, yeah, I never really thought of it that. Now, incidentally, they have changed their policy, and now they're open for reclaim 24/7. I mean, they consider that an emergency situation for a reclaim now, which I'm really happy to say. But I mean, Mark, you're my boss. You know, if my dog ever got picked up, I'd be texting you on the way to the shelter. Can't make that meeting. You know, this is what happened. But a lot of people can't take the day off of work. A lot of people don't have that opportunity. And when you have restrictive policies like that, it just makes it a lot harder.
And I think a lot of this has been implied with the great information and examples that you gave, Scott. But can you kind of dig in a little bit more on the same topic and kind of really get into how that potentially affects kind of the population that we're focusing on in this town hall?
Yeah, I mean, I think that in what we commonly refer to as the low income areas, people are less apt to be able to take days off from work, and they're living paycheck to paycheck. You know, so when we actually have to impound an animal and bring it to the shelter, and I know, you know, we were going to talk about it, I'm just going to jump right into those fees and fines and all that. Some of them are astronomical. So now if you know, you're a hardworking guy trying to support a family, and you have a pet that you love, and it accidentally gets out, and he gets picked up by animal control and brought to the shelter. Now you have to ask your boss for a day off. You have to get the money to, you know, you have to consider sacrificing something else for that money if you even can have it. Perfect example was, and again, you know, I was in a shelter in California, and I think it was California, might have been Florida. Anyway, I literally watched a guy come in to the shelter to reclaim his animal that had been picked up 3 days ago. He knew on day one that the animal had been picked up, but he couldn't get the day off of work, and he didn't have the money. So he begged, you know, got money from his friends and family, and took the day off and came down. By the time he got to the shelter, the dog had already been there 3 days. The quote he got for how much he owed was based on day one. So when he got there, more money had been put onto his bill because of impound fees and boarding facility fees. So he didn't have enough. And I watched this gentleman almost break down crying, saying, I did everything I could to get this money. I didn't know it was going to be more. And I watched this poor woman behind the counter just sit there and say, I'm sorry, I can't help you. You know, there's no way they're allowed to waive fees. There's no way they're allowed to help people. And to me, that's, you know, helping people out in a situation like that's the epitome of what we should be doing. You know, I mean, it was an accident. And this guy, it was the first time the dog had ever gotten out. Dog was not, you know, not licensed, which, Akeisha, I'm with you. I am totally against licensing in all shapes and ways. It doesn't work. You know, it's not cost effective or functioning. And, you know, the dog wasn't vaccinated, but they could have they vaccinated him at the shelter. So all of these things combined, it made it impossible for this guy to get his dog back. And it happens, that's just one example that I just happen to be standing there watching. It happens all over the country. And whether or not it's by choice or by, you know, by ordinance or policy, I mean, a lot of people who work at the front counter of animal shelters are afraid to go against policy because what's going to happen? They're going to get fired. Same with animal control officers. I'm required to pick up this animal. If I get caught not doing my job, I could get fired or sued. You know, they don't want to deal with that negative, the impact that might carry. And some, you know, and some of these fees are astronomical. I mean, they're not in line with what should be happening. You know, what should be calculated.
Thanks, Scott. And, obviously, Scott, you are a graduate of the police academy. You've been involved in field services, animal control for decades, a lot of experience. And I'm sure that, with the topic of today's town hall, I'd really be interested if, and you don't need to call anybody out or anything specific, but I'd be really interested if you could give the attendees kind of an example, that kind of first thing that comes to your head about, enforcement that's been selective, specifically toward either BIPOC or low income. I know Akeisha hit on this a little bit already, but I'm sure that that's something that would be really interesting to hear from your perspective.
Yeah, sure. And sadly, it's true. It does happen. I think there's still a thought within the general public, and officers are not immune to this thought, but there's still a general perception that if you can't afford a pet, you shouldn't have a pet. And people use that to get animals away from people. And I remember talking to this one officer who made a joke out of it. And it was sad to hear him say that. He goes into these neighborhoods and he literally said, I feel like Oprah going in there, because it's like, you get a ticket, you get a ticket, you all get tickets today. And it really made me sad to think that there was someone representing animal control that would pick that a comparison. It's going into a neighborhood, you should be going in to solve problems and help people. And with all of the services today, if you need help, there's so many services out there to give it to get help. And the work that I have done, Mark, that there's one thing I have found is that people who live in low income areas and all that, they don't dislike their pets. They don't love their pets any less than we do, or in a lot of cases, they even more so, because they build a stronger bond. I've seen more, and I hate in more upscale neighborhoods where the dog is more of a status symbol, and it's I don't want to get too involved in calling anyone out, but I see far too many people that have show dogs and they're fancy dogs that they don't have a real bond with that animal. But you go into these some of these neighborhoods that I've worked in, and I've always been assigned to predominantly low income areas in my career in field services, and I have worked both. I'm not saying I haven't, but I prefer to work in low income areas, because those are where I find real people doing really great things and working, loving their animals and taking pride in their animals. But they just don't have the same resources that a lot of other people do. And we expect them to be able to afford, the top line food, and heaven forbid your animal gets hit by a car, you have to have enough money to provide every, medical treatment available under the sun. I mean, some of that stuff we can't even afford. But there's that expectation that you have to have a certain level of income in order to own a pet. And there are people out there that will do anything they can to get an animal away, even if that means bringing them into a high volume shelter where the animal's life is in danger, which really makes no sense to me at all.
Yeah, it's a really good point. So you did touch on fines and fees, and I did want to talk to you about that. So I'm glad that you did, and thank you for that. I think something else that is, just kind of give us some food for thought is, for a lot of us in companion animal welfare, anti-tethering laws seem like no-brainer. Good thing. We know the negative effects of tethering animals. But that said, we wouldn't be talking about it. There tends to be some negatives to those kind of laws. And can you elaborate on that for us, Scott?
Yeah, I can. And as a career-long animal cruelty investigator, I've seen my fair share of animals just chained to a tree, or tied up, outside to a fence post. And that's why those laws are there. And like you said, those laws are legitimate and needed. But I think we all too often take it to an extreme. There are people who don't have fenced in yards. And you shouldn't have to rely on just taking your dog for a walk a couple of times a day to get them their exercise. Runners are not that bad. If you're sitting home on a Saturday afternoon and you're cleaning your house, or you're reading a book or whatever, having your dog out on a tether, as long as he has protection from the elements and all that, it's not a bad thing. And it gives the animal the opportunity to sit outside and lie in the grass and chew on a bone, for crying out loud, whatever. And I think that we take it to the extreme with a lot of anti-tethering laws. It's like never, ever, ever can you have a dog tied to anything, ever. And if you do, we're going to come and take it. And these places where we're talking, again, are getting back to the places where they don't have fences. They may be living in an apartment. And there's nothing wrong with doing that every now and again, responsibly. And again, I know people are going to be, getting in a little bit of an uproar because I said this, but, those laws are in place to prevent animal cruelty. Just having an animal out on a runner or even a long leash, as long as it can't, hang himself. And I've seen that, it's a touchy thing. I've seen animals wrapped around a tree and strangling themselves or hung off of a porch, or, I've personally seen the negative effects. And for me, I have to look at all of the negative things that I've seen in my life and not apply it to every situation in the world, and I think that officers sometimes fall guilty of that, and through no fault of their own. We see so much negativity. We see people fight with us. People do the worst possible things imaginable to animals. And we go into a community and we have these shaded glasses on. We look through shaded lenses like, everybody, Mark, you're going to do it. Akeisha, you're going to do it. Lydia, you're going to do it, because that's what we're so used to. And another thing, officers generally only get to see the negative. And that's why one of my biggest things that I preach out there is to get the officers into positive situations, getting them out, doing community engagement, having, when I ran animal control in DC, I wanted all my officers to spend time at the local dog parks, and you couldn't bring a ticket book into the dog park. All you could bring into the dog park was a tennis ball and a bag of biscuits. And you met people and you talked to them, and you weren't allowed to, complain about licensing or vaccinations or any of that. It was an opportunity to meet people in a positive setting, because we do see so much negative. And I do think that we do that with tethering. We see a dog tied out and we automatically envision the dogs that have been hung, the dogs that have been strangled by it. And we get all tense, we get all tight, and we can't have that. We can't have that. And I think that's really, that's the problem we see today.
Thank you so much, Scott. So Larry, first and foremost, we again also want to thank you for joining us all the way from Los Angeles. I know it's still kind of working hours, and Akeisha alluded, but congratulations to you, the Animal Service Board of Commissioners, Brenda Barnett, and the LA community for the amazing progress that's gone on there and your specific participation in that, Larry. Your area of expertise is a really important topic for us in animal welfare. And you have a lot of variations of this, but I would love to start, because I'm sure you have thoughts when you joined the Board of Animal Services, where you were bringing these two worlds together, the Coalition for Economic Survival, as well as now you were, at that time, member of the board, now that you're president of the board. And can you just kind of tell us what your focus was and reason for joining the Board of Commissioners? And Larry, you're on mute, so you want to unmute. Sorry about that. There you go.
So thanks for having me here. It's a great opportunity. So clearly I'm a animal lover. We have pets. We have cats and dogs, and my wife did TNR in our neighborhood and did about 30, 40 cats in our neighborhood, and basically we don't have that problem anymore. But for over 4 decades, I've been with the Coalition for a grassroots human rights organization. We organize and empower tenants throughout the LA, bring rent control to the city of Los Angeles. We actually incorporated the city of West Hollywood in regards to housing issues and maintaining rent control, and elected our members to the city council there. And basically every law that gives some protections to tenants, we had a hand in. And so it seemed like it was a a natural fit for me because of what I saw over the decades of working in housing, particularly in low income and communities of color, seeing that pets had become eviction tools for landlords. And in many cases, because in LA, if you get the tenant out, you can jack up the rent to market. And so landlords look for every which way to get tenants out so they can jack up rents. And clearly having a pet puts sort of a bullseye on those tenants' back. The other issue is that Los Angeles is a city of renters. Over nearly 2/3 of the residents of Los Angeles are renters. And for us to really be a no-kill city and get the animals out of our shelters into forever homes, we needed to, most of those animals needed to go into apartments. And so we needed to figure out a way to open those doors for landlords who have restricted pets for their tenants. And so it seemed like a natural coalition for me being on the board, given the work that I've done. And also the fact that, you know, it is an economic issue for many pet owners. I mean, you know, Los Angeles is the most unaffordable city in the nation as far as rent burden. People are paying the highest percentage of their income to rent. Half of our people live in unaffordable housing, paying more than 30% of their income to rent. And 1 in 3 households pay at least 50% of their income to rent, leaving them little to other basic necessities. Los Angeles has the highest poverty rate in the nation. 1 out of every 4 households live in poverty. Our rate is about 26%. We have the most overcrowded conditions in the nation. 5 out of the 10 most overcrowded zip codes are in LA, with the #1 most crowded zip code here. We're the homeless capital of the nation. And with the COVID situation, things have just gotten worse. I mean, almost 2/3 of the households in LA have experienced earning declines over the last 2 to 3 months, and the highest impacted by that are our Latino and African-American communities. Nearly 21% of our residents are unemployed. And so to think about these people, not only how they're going to take care of their families and keep a roof over their heads, having a pet unfortunately adds additional burden to them economically. And so it's incumbent upon us as the animal service department is to address those issues to the best that we can. And so since I've been on the commission, I think we've made tremendous inroads. I mean, we've had a very close partnership with Best Friends. Best Friends runs one of our animal shelters in Mission Hills and another center in South LA. And the effort, and I actually would have to take some exception to some of the issues that were raised here, because in LA, we've had a partnership with a lot of the rescues to make this a no-kill city. And the cornerstone of that has been spay neuter. And that's why we've invested a lot of effort on ensuring particularly low-income communities be accessible, have accessibility to spay neuter. We have 5 mobile spay neuter trucks going out targeting low-income communities. We have spay neuter vouchers that provides free spay neuter to low-income people, and they don't even have to show proof. They just can self-certify themselves as far as their address, because we're targeting certain addresses. We've set up a partnership with a legal aids and rescue group on Skid Row to address the issue of the homeless population there and figuring out how we can provide services to the homeless population. And so I think in dealing with these issues, you know, it's one thing to try and ensure the safety of the animals, but you also have to think in these economic times, those challenges have increased significantly just because of the basis of people's economic situation and their ability or inability to keep a roof over their heads.
Yeah, absolutely, Larry. And I think the thing that I hope to clarify just in regards to the spay and neuter, we're talking about mandated laws. And I think the thing that has happened in Los Angeles, especially lifting barriers for people to have to provide proof and the things that have happened in LA that have provided those resources into areas that really are resource deserts. But that is not I think the point that Akeisha would make is that was not because there was a mandatory law for spay neuter that was happening and showing a reduction. It was actually a community effort to provide resources into that community versus having a mandatory spay and neuter law. But I'm glad that you're bringing this up.
Best friends was key to that partnership, no doubt.
Oh, with amongst thousands of others in LA, absolutely, absolutely. Most importantly, you all at LA Animal Services. I do want to, especially specifically with your area of housing, because I think it's a really important topic for us because it's a huge barrier. You know, with your work in LA and the Coalition for Economic Survival, you know, what are you all working on, or members of your coalition, for opening doors with landlords who have tenants with pets? Can you talk about some of that work?
Yeah, so we were able to get the city council to pass a ordinance or a motion to set up a committee of stakeholders, landlords and tenant groups and rescue groups, and animal advocates, to sort of explore what it would take to open those doors for landlords, at the same time not added rents or security deposits to tenants who can't afford that. We were looking at bringing in those who have pet-friendly buildings to talk to other landlords, but unfortunately COVID came and you know, disrupted everything. The other thing we've been doing is one of the things I was able to do when I was on the commission is bring two departments together that I work with, clearly Animal Services, but also the LA Housing Department. And what we ended up doing, and we've been doing for the last 4 years, is having pets in housing workshops throughout the city. As part of the Housing Department does a monthly workshops on the rent stabilization ordinance. And so we were able to take a month devoted to pets and join together with Animal Services. And so not only did we do these things with the Housing Department, but we were able to do it in the shelters. And so it was a way of bringing in people who had never been to the shelters to come to the workshops, and we would give them tours of the shelters, and hopefully they'd walk away with one of their new best friends. I mean, we always pitch that. But it was very interesting because we had a lot of landlords at these workshops, and the issue they raised the most was the Fair Housing Act and their concern about emotional support animals, and thinking that it was unfair and that any tenant can do this, and so we had attorneys there from Housing Rights Center that focuses in on Fair Housing Act, and it was good in that we were able to explain what their obligations were under Fair Housing Act, and that the tenants had rights and that they had to make reasonable accommodations for having those pets there. They were emotional support animals. And so we did a lot of education of landlords. I mean, not many of them were unhappy, but at least they understood and they weren't harassing the tenants. They did bring up one issue that was very interesting. And actually it's the issue that I've tried to get support from our California insurance commissioner, is that their big concern was that their insurance companies were telling them that they can't have large dogs, otherwise it jeopardized their insurance policies. And my thought was, well, okay, that doesn't make sense, because what in reality what it is that the insurance companies are actually undermining the Fair Housing Act, because you don't want the landlords to lose their insurance. At the same time, insurance companies should not be dictating the breed or the size of dogs for emotional support animals. And so there was a lot of interest in that from our state elected officials. It's something that I'm continually trying to sell and get some type of legislation around. It's something that we should think in terms of ways that we can maybe bring landlords along, at the same time open the doors for tenants with pets.
That's really interesting, because I assume that when you're bringing those two groups together, it was really to help tenants understand their rights. But it sounds like you actually found that landlords were coming to these meetings as well, so you were able to actually inform landlords of the rights that tenants have. Is that right?
Yes, yes. And I did want to mention another law that we were able to get through the city council some years back, which actually has a real impact on tenants being able to maintain their pets. And that is, we run a tenants' rights clinic with volunteer attorneys, and it's a place where we can give individual counseling to tenants, but we're also able to track trends. And what the trend we started seeing is that landlords figured out a way to get tenants out of their rent-controlled apartments by changing the terms of tenancies and creating new rules, regulations. So we were able to take what we were seeing in the clinic, brought it to our city council, and we got a law passed that said you cannot change the terms of tenancy unless the landlord and the tenant agree to it. And where that comes into play is that if you have a pet or it was in your rental agreement, a landlord or a new landlord that bought the building can't come along and then say, well, I'm changing the policy. You need to get out, get your dog out or your cat out, or you all have to get out. And so that's been a tremendous tool in protecting tenants in Los Angeles. And it's something that also went together with one of the investments we made as Animal Services, is that we set up these, we had these groups, intervention groups at many of our shelters to try and talk to tenants or people who were bringing in and relinquishing their pets. And they were able to explain, because most tenants don't know their rights, unfortunately, and they were able to use this particular law to get those people to hold on to their pets, knowing that the landlord didn't have the right to tell them to get rid of them.
What it looks like in a lot of aspects of tenants' rights as well, you have recently worked on some very specific things as COVID has kind of hit, in regards to helping to protect evictions and those kind of things. Can you elaborate? And I know you maybe touched on some of this already, but really specifically some of the stuff most recently that you've been able to do to try to protect people from evictions and anything else that you want to add in regards to kind of the COVID situation, and maybe that can carry on post-COVID if that ever happens, hopefully.
And I think it's important because we all need to be aware of this. And so when COVID hit and people who were losing their jobs and couldn't pay the rent and were facing eviction for non-payment of rent, we were able to get laws passed throughout the state. The governor did an emergency order, and the city of Los Angeles put through well, it's protections against evictions if you could not pay your rent due to COVID. But along with that, the city of LA at least passed additional protections, basically suspending the ability to evict for no fault. It's called no fault evictions, which are things like moving in a relative, moving in a manager, converting the buildings to condos, creating a nuisance because you have more people. You couldn't be evicted for bringing in extra people, and you could not be evicted for having a pet. So that has put additional protections, but we all have to be aware, look, we are on the tracks of an economic train wreck that's coming because these eviction protections will eventually come off for people who've lost their job. Their jobs may not be there anymore. UCLA did a study on the eviction moratoriums here in LA, and they predict that if the moratoriums come off and expire, 365,000 households are at risk of eviction because they've lost their jobs and they no longer have access to unemployment benefits. And this is not just in LA, this is throughout the nation. And so one of the things actually on the agenda for next Tuesday, I'm asking the department to start thinking in terms of being prepared for that, because we may see an avalanche of pets coming to our shelter to the fact of people losing their homes and their jobs.
Larry, I could talk to you for hours, but I just really appreciate, that's really good information, and it's obvious how this kind of wraps in renting rights, how this affects low income. I just really appreciate you giving us the time and your expertise, and please stick around because I'm sure you're going to have a few questions for people, amongst the attendees. Thank you. So Lydia LaSalle, thank you for joining us. And I really want to get with you a little bit more specific into some shelter practices and policies, which is, definitely your wheelhouse amongst others. And maybe to start, kind of talking about a little bit about discrepancies within our shelter practices and policies that negatively affect BIPOC and low-income community members, maybe talking about implicit bias in areas such as adoptions or how that plays into this kind of town hall topic, and the effects of life-saving in general.
Sure. Yeah. So first, with implicit bias, just to define it, that it's just an unconscious thing that we might have a stereotype or an attitude towards a certain type of person, or it could be men, women, anybody. And sometimes we don't realize that we're making decisions based on this, meaning in our world, it might be an adoption decision. So it's between someone getting an animal or not getting an animal. And I think one of those things, and this goes for explicit bias when we're doing adoption policies, because a lot of us want to do open adoptions. We want the community to come in, but to really understand this, I like to say you have to name it, claim it, challenge it, and then change it. You have to be aware that it's happening, and you have to see what those stereotypes are. So if you're a person that's like, oh, well, I think a certain person, so they have to drive a certain car or look a certain way or have a certain job to fit my perception of what I think a perfect adopter is, and challenging those thoughts, because those do become barriers, because obviously there is a diverse amount of people, and people come from, and we want the community so much to come in and adopt, but then at the same time, we're not recognizing the things that we will do in our policies, not consciously, to really prevent that from happening.
Makes a lot of sense. So, coming into that, let's get into a kind of particular kind of foundational work that a lot of us in animal welfare, whether we're rescue or shelters, kind of rely on, which is events. Whether it's adoption, outreach. Can you talk about how often animal welfare events maybe fall into this bias role? which we're addressing obviously in today's town hall.
Yeah. So one of the larger events we did prior to COVID, we called them super adoptions. So these are large scale adoption events where we invite shelters and rescues across the state of Utah to participate. And when we were changing our venue, it used to be on the east side of the city. Well, we suggested to put it on the west side of the city where, yes, people of color, more people of color live on our west side of our community in Salt Lake City. And people were making comments, some people that were participating, well, I don't feel comfortable with that demographic, or I don't feel comfortable of going to that side of the community. And it's really checking why we have, again, checking those biases, challenging those biases and saying, well, why do I have that? Is that some sort of just anecdotal story I have about this one time that I did an event on the west side and this happened? And really seeing if you really want to be inclusive, you have to start thinking creatively about events, where a lot of people are doing events on the east side of Salt Lake City and not thinking about ways that you can be more inclusive and challenging these stereotypes and these conceptions that you have.
Yeah, absolutely. A couple other, another really foundational tenet that's going to be extremely important for any, community that's focusing on life saving is foster care. Can you, address, foster care practices that also disproportionately affect BIPOC and low income communities?
Yeah. So when I think of foster care, sometimes I've seen it's harder to foster an animal for an organization than it is to adopt an animal. And sometimes when we think about that, it could be as, well, I don't want to have a person foster if they don't have transportation, if they don't have a car. The assumption is, okay, well, then they're not going to be able to go to appointments, or they're not going to be able to handle emergency, where it's like, okay, they probably have someone that can help them with that, or take a lift, and being creative about that. Or Scott mentioned this with hours of operation. Same thing with fostering. If your hours of operation where you're interfacing with your foster parents are just like, 10 to 4, well, how are you including people that have maybe 1 to 2 or 2 jobs, 3 jobs, or just have crazy schedules, and we're trying to accommodate? So thinking of creative ways to open your hours, doing things virtually, really thinking outside of the box to be really inclusive. And some of those things could be you're checking in with their landlord, or, all these type of things. And it's like, okay, we want your temporary help for this animal, and we want to save lives. There's an urgency around this. So we should take any opportunity to get an animal into a house temporarily. And we're not thinking about those little things that we think, I call it like the what if. Well, what if something happens and this happens, and you go down this whole path where basically you what if yourself out of having a community connection. And that goes for anything, adoption, foster in this case. So I think it's just being really aware and examining how accessible you really are.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. So one other thing that I want you to kind of talk about before we get into questions from the folks that are attending with us is kind of community outreach. So a lot of us, it's going to require us to go into different parts of our community, whether it's through adoptions, outreach, veterinary efforts, and those kind of things, to ultimately increase life saving in our community and get to the animals and the people, most importantly, that need our help, that are potentially in resource deserts, those kind of things. With these type of efforts and work, can you kind of point out for us where you see areas of opportunity for us to do a bit better as a movement in the realm of low income and BIPOC communities?
Yes. I think when we're thinking about our community work, so some of the work that Best Friends does is in reservations, and thinking about, the concept is like, well, we want to get those animals out, we want to fix them, which of course we want to do all those things. But when we're going into communities, are we really looking at the big picture, the big context? What is really going on in the community that's creating this? And sometimes we forget about that and how important it is to see the intersectionality of all these different things that happen in communities, and seeing, okay, this is happening because of this, and this is a real opportunity too, where we can collaborate with other nonprofits in these communities. There's so many nonprofits that are working with human services and doing so many things. As animal welfare individuals, it's such a great opportunity to be like, how can we work together to support these communities, and really thinking about the systemic issues that are happening, that are affecting people and their animals, and looking at it from there, I think is just a really important thing. And that goes for, you know, when I think of backyard breeding, that's a big thing, obviously. And of course, I don't like that. We don't like that. But we have to think, okay, well, why is that happening? Why is that economy happening there? Like, what's the substitute economy if someone's been making money this way, and that's the only way they have been making money? And it's not because they're trying to do something to be anti-animal advocacy or animal welfare. It's really just a circumstance. So looking at that and saying, well, how can we create better resources in our community for all sorts of things, and working with human services to achieve that, I think is really important in this.
Mark, you're muted.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Lydia. That's really great stuff. I do want to take some time to get some answers, some questions answered that have hit for you guys in the panel. But the first one, I actually think I'm going to take the answer myself, if that's okay. It's a really great question. And it seems like a majority of all the shelters labeled kill shelters are in under-resourced minority communities, and no kill is used in white orgs. Do you think these terms of shame are appropriate in our efforts to lower racial barriers? And I think that's, it's a really interesting topic, and we actually look at, and have recently looked at, we've released a data set most recently around the country, and the thing that is actually factual in some areas of actually Hispanic majority communities, there seems to be a lack of no-kill shelters. But overall, there's actually no-kill shelters that kind of transcend demographics and areas. And I think it would surprise a lot of people on this call that many no-kill shelters preside in communities that actually have a lot of money. It doesn't necessarily equate highly to areas that are largely minority or largely low income. Obviously, there are a lot of those shelters, even if they're in communities with money. A lot of it depends on where is the municipal money and priority for that shelter system going. So there's definitely some indiscretion in regards to where they're prioritizing their animals. But whether it's the South, the Northeast, anywhere in the country, you know, there's, you know, over 33, 34% of the shelters in all of these different variations of communities that actually can reach no-kill status. So it actually isn't really a black and white issue. It's really, you know, it's a much more complicated effort, whether it's in a municipal world where you have individuals, again, that are, you know, where do animals come in the priority in their shelters, even though the community is not necessarily, you know, high in poverty like Los Angeles. And you think you've heard Larry talk about Los Angeles. That is a shelter system that is on the verge of no-kill status and has been for a number of years now. So it doesn't really equate to kill shelters, which, you know, is not a proper term. Shelters that are currently killing strays, shelters that are not currently no-kill. That, you know, they kind of transcend communities. And I think that's the best thing that I can put for it. And we do look at that a lot in data, and it's really interesting. So Scott, I think the first question I have is going to be for you. And I think it's in regards to when you were talking about, you know, 24-hour reuniting service. And the question is, are animal control officers trained to actually reunite? How do they do that? How do they staff that?
Well, in the particular instance that I mentioned, those officers were originally not trained to do that, and a lot of agencies work on an emergency on-call basis after normal business hours. So, you know, an officer will pull their daily shift, their regular shift, and then they'll go on to on-call. And at that point, they'll usually only respond to emergencies. In this particular case, the director realized what was happening, and he said, no, we do want to get these animals out of here as quickly as possible. So he classified that as an emergency call out and gave the officers the training to do that.
Perfect. Akeisha, I've got one for you, if that's okay. It's a wonderful question. Shelters contracting with municipalities who require fees for boarding or impoundment may or may not be able to keep the fees to offset cost of sheltering as part of the contract. With COVID-19, many contracts are being contracted. How can we educate municipalities to financially support animal control and sheltering at a level that gives shelters freedom to operate and waive fees?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I will direct you to our advocacy page, which gives a lot of information on how to work with local government bodies, not just the elected officials, but also those staff, the city managers about the issues. And there's also some non-animal welfare organizations out there doing some work right now about why it's not really fiscally sound to start, looking at putting more fines and fees into any type of agency structure to relieve budgetary strain. It does just the opposite. So I'm not sure who asked that question, but I am happy to give you a couple of links offline if that's a possibility. I know that one organization that I just talked to is I think it's called the Center for Fiscal Policy, if I've got that correctly. So there are definitely ways to do that. We also have a number of network partners that have kind of faced the same thing that you're facing. I think Pima County is one that has taken an innovative approach to waiving fees in some instances and making licenses more affordable for people who are low income, and really working with the community to ultimately make sure that pets aren't being taken away from people, because there is a daily cost, as I know that you're aware of impounding animals, and those costs are not, rarely if ever offset by penalties. So thank you for that question. I appreciate it.
And it's Jan McHugh Smith, and I can definitely pass that on to you. Akeisha, and please, Larry. Yes.
Yeah, so people need to be aware of another aspect of this. I mean, in LA, we try and keep our fees as low as possible. Our licenses are $20. It's $10 if you're low income or a senior. And the reason for these fees are to ensure that the dogs because it's not cats or not, that they're vaccinated, that we prevent breeding as a way of using the licensing, because it's a much higher fee, and to ensure the microchipping, and also to track if it's a dangerous animal, with a lot of various cases that have come up. But the reality, and so we're doing things like that. I'm bringing in a motion to ask for a study on Tuesday, seeing if we can cut our redemption fees or eliminate it for homeless and low-income people. And so we have a food pantry going. So, and we're now looking at possible medical assistance for pet owners. But the other aspect of this, people should know that the animal shelter systems in this country are really being hit hard by this. So we're not the top priority in the city of Los Angeles as far as the budget goes. We've always had to struggle for enough money from the city. Now we've had a cut significantly. We're going to lose 20% of our staff because of buyouts, and then an additional 27 because of furloughs that are being mandated on us. And so trying to operate this is challenging beyond belief, because of the cuts, because of COVID, because of cities not having the revenue, and we just need to be more creative in figuring out how to care for animals. I mean, one of the things we've been trying to do is keep the dogs out and pets out of our shelters by keeping them where people in communities network. through the internet, through Facebook, to return those pets to the owners. We've had some rescues over the July 4th weekend who had scams, and we actually did really well. One of our best July 4ths ever. But it's these type of creative things we need to, it's a new world. And we're never going to go back to the way it was, because this is pretty significant impact on us all.
Larry, I want to stick with you and just see, there's two separate questions that I just kind of want to get some info on. Do you have, options, or recommendations to find options for available for homeless people with pets who have to be gone for a few months, whether it's treatment or jail, or also references for laws, where landlords can't change terms of tenancy?
So the terms, I'll take the terms of tenancy. I mean, that was a local law. It's part of our rent stabilization ordinance. Unfortunately, most cities don't have rent stabilization ordinances, but it's a political fight, and landlord shouldn't come around and change the rules. I mean, you think about a homeowner who has a mortgage that's set. The banks don't come along and say, hey, you can no longer have pets here, or you can't do this, or you can't do that. That should extend to renters as well. But it's going to take a local effort of the community to try and get their elected officials to pass some type of protections like that. As far as the homeless, this is a huge concern of ours. As I said, we put in money and help subsidize a program with Downtown Dogs and the Inner City Law Center to provide both medical care and other types of care, as well as legal assistance to people on Skid Row. Downtown Dogs has expanded and is now opening up another facility in the South LA area. But it's a huge say. It all takes money, and it's harder and harder to get local jurisdictions to invest in new programs when they're trying to hold on to the existing programs. But we need more housing for the homeless. Clearly, that's a lot of money. But I have answers, but as far as reality, I don't have the answers dealing in this environment at this point. It's just going to be difficult for the next couple of years.
If I could just chime in really quickly on that that lease question. So this isn't legal advice, but everybody's laws, state laws, local laws are different. There are states that have more protections for tenants than others, and localities that have more protections. And one of the great things, Larry, you mentioned your partnership with Legal Aid. That is a great resource in a lot of communities. It is eligible. People with lower income are eligible to call these intake lines for Legal Aid and get free legal advice on a number of different things. So we're talking about pets, but there's also an issue of contract, right? So regardless of what the lease says about pets, there's a contract that protects both sides, generally, if there's a written lease. So that's one of the things that a local attorney, at a Legal Aid might be able to assist with as well.
Absolutely, yes.
Thank you, Keisha. So Scott, I've got another one for you, and then Lydia, I've got one for you coming up next. Scott, if there's no licensing and they don't have, and if they waive impound fees, there's a question here of how Animal Services keeps running, because they're already desperately underfunded, and Larry's pointing that out. So this question has helped me understand the funding side of this.
Yeah, and it is a good question, and people usually look at that as a revenue source, and in most places that have taken a close look realize, and I think Keisha alluded to this, is that it costs more. In most places, it costs more to administer and enforce the licensing program than it does generating the revenue. You know, the agencies that have switched to doing it have all done, you know, financial impact statements. Albuquerque, New Mexico, for one, I know that they found out that they were losing, I think, $27,000 a year trying to just manage that program. And $27,000 a year goes a long way. And actually they were able to convince the city to give them that money still out of, you know, out of the budget, and use that to provide free microchipping to the residents. So, you know, I mean, I know there must be agencies out there somewhere that it's working. I just don't know of any. And I mean, everyone I've seen, and I've seen a lot, the compliance rate is low. They send officers out writing up citations or warning notices or for failure to license, which takes time, and, you know, time is money. You know, you send an officer out on a call, that costs money. They have bench warrants, as Akeisha mentioned. You know, you don't pay your fines, you get a bench warrant issued, you have to go to court. All of that stuff costs money to administer. And most of the places that I've dealt with, and I've dealt with a lot, feel that it just costs. I mean, they've actually done studies. I don't want to say they feel it. They've done studies. They've looked at it. It all comes down to dollars and cents, where they're spending more than they're making. And it's just, it makes sense. The one exception that I'm aware of was Calgary in Canada. And that was a situation that is yet to be emulated, that I've seen anyway. I haven't seen anyone emulate. I don't know what they're currently like, but I know several years ago, they had a 98% compliance rate for a city the size, that's a huge city. And they had incentives for licensing. It was a remarkable program that even I tried to emulate it in DC and couldn't make it happen. But other than that, I've never heard of an agency anywhere that it actually generates revenue at the end of the day.
Over the cost of expense.
Right.
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 So Lydia, one of the things that, you know, you illuminated on a lot of kind of foundational pieces of shelter and rescue policy, and you in Salt Lake City, like a lot of us in animal welfare, are really expanding the bounds of kind of community supported animal sheltering. And you guys in Salt Lake for a long time have been extremely, you know, supported by foster care, especially for your dogs that you do not house dogs. And you've continued year after year to be able to pull more animals through and in and out of your system. What are some of the things that you've been able, like some of the stuff that you talked about in a program that looks like yours, that you kind of keep an eye on, where you're helping your staff understand the benefit of going to the west side versus the east side, you know, being more inclusive in foster care and adoption? Can you talk about, you know, some of the really foundational things you as a executive director kind of keep your eye on to see that kind of progression happening in the actual operations?
Yeah, so we have a great community in Salt Lake City, and we have, like Mark said, a ton of animals that are in foster care. So most of our animals, we have over 600 animals in care. 95% of them are in foster homes and a foster network. So I think the big part of this is bringing a lot of different people to the table in a lot of these conversations, and also being able to include our volunteers on this, I think, is a big thing as well. But I think one of the biggest things that we've been able to do is, well, we've adopted a lot too, obviously, and a part of that is accessibility. We've actually done more adoptions now than we did pre-COVID. In the same period of time. And again, I think that's like accessibility. So really looking at who the audience is. One of the things that we're doing next month, we're doing a partnership with Telemundo, which is our local station here. And we're doing a big adoption event, and we're trying to facilitate that the best we can. We're going to get volunteers that will be on standby to be translators. We're making everything accessible, and it's just really looking at that, like looking at the larger community. And the big thing for me is that I volunteer and I try to connect with other community members, so you get other ideas, because sometimes I think we're in our animal welfare world and we're just talking to the same people all the time and doing the same thing over and over, because we have this small community of animal rescuers, which is great. That's our supportive community, but being able to expand that. So I think for me and my team is just being open-minded being able to make those connections and take that advice from other people and be like, hey, what's going on in your community? What's going on in this? And being able to partner, well, we can't really do that now with festivals, but you know, having partnerships and those type of things. So I think that's the simple answer of that is being open-minded and knowing that you're a part of a larger nonprofit community as well. And there's so many people that want to partner and expand your reach with you.
Awesome, thank you. Well, we usually do these for an hour. We obviously been going almost an hour and a half, but I really loved having the panelists that we have and getting to dig in a little bit. If you did ask a question and it didn't get answered, we do follow up on those. Remember that this lives on, so you will have access to be able to, you know, for anybody that missed this wonderful town hall, you're going to be able to access it post the time that we did it. Akeisha, Scott, Larry, Lydia, thank you so much for taking the time to do this and actually doing it with a little bit more extended time. The information was amazing. I also want to thank the Best Friends Network team who work tirelessly to put this together every week, make sure everything's going on. This is a great format, and I just want to thank all of you. Many of you stuck with us for a long time, and thank you for the great questions, and thank you for your interest and participation in this Best Friends Town Hall. Hopefully we'll see many of you next week. Everybody take care.